18,800. That's how many Yakuza members remained in Japan by the end of 2024, down from over 180,000 in the 1960s. The most organized crime syndicate in history is collapsing, not from gang wars, not from police shootouts, but from something far more devastating: bureaucratic strangulation. Japan didn't outlaw the Yakuza, they made it impossible for them to exist. And the strategy is working so well that it's creating something potentially more dangerous. Stay with me, because what replaced the Yakuza might be worse than what came before. To understand how Japan dismantled organized crime, you first need to understand what the Yakuza actually were, because they weren't like gangs anywhere else in the world. The Yakuza at their peak, 1963. Peak Yakuza membership hits 184,000 members across Japan. These weren't street thugs hiding in shadows, they were a parallel government operating in plain sight. The Yakuza operated openly in ways that would be unthinkable in Western countries. They had office buildings with signs displaying their organization names. They printed business cards identifying themselves as members of specific syndicates. They maintained tax-paying front companies that filed paperwork with government regulators. They attended community festivals, often providing security or organizing local events. They provided disaster relief after earthquakes and tsunamis, arriving before government agencies with food, water, and supplies. Some politicians openly acknowledged their support during election campaigns, though this practice became increasingly rare as anti-Yakuza sentiment grew. This wasn't normal behavior for organized crime anywhere else in the world. In the United States, Italy, Mexico, and other countries, criminal organizations hide their identities and operations from public view, operating through layers of legitimate business fronts and using violence to maintain secrecy. The Yakuza displayed themselves proudly, protected by a unique aspect of Japanese law that many foreigners found incomprehensible. Membership itself wasn't illegal. You could be a known, acknowledged member of a criminal syndicate without breaking any law, as long as you weren't caught committing specific criminal acts. The structure was feudal, mirroring traditional Japanese social hierarchies that date back centuries. At the top sat the oyabun, the father figure who commanded absolute loyalty. Below him, a hierarchy of kobun, or children, bound by ritual and tradition more powerful than legal contracts. The relationship wasn't just criminal, it was familial, cemented through sake ceremonies that formalized bonds considered stronger than blood. These ceremonies involved ritualized drinking of sake, exchanges of sake cups, and formal vows that members took more seriously than marriage vows or business contracts. Yakuza members identified themselves through full-body tattoos called irizumi, expensive and painful processes that took years to complete and cost tens of thousands of dollars. The tattoos covered their bodies from neck to ankles, leaving only hands, feet, and head visible. Each design told a story, incorporating traditional Japanese imagery like dragons, koi fish, cherry blossoms, and Buddhist deities. The pain of receiving these tattoos, applied with traditional hand-poked methods rather than modern tattoo machines, was considered a demonstration of endurance and commitment. They practiced yubitsume, the ritual amputation of finger joints as apology for failures or disrespect towards superiors. A member who failed in his duties would cut off the tip of his little finger and present it to his oyabun, wrapped in cloth as a physical manifestation of apology and commitment to do better. Repeat failures would result in additional joints being removed, creating visible markers of a member's history within the organization. These weren't mere gang initiations designed to demonstrate toughness. They were cultural practices with centuries of history, rooted in samurai traditions and Japanese concepts of honor, obligation, and hierarchy. The major syndicates controlled territories across Japan with precision that rivaled corporate franchises. The Yamaguchi-gumi, based in Kobe, was and remains the largest despite its dramatic decline. At its peak in 1991, it had 63,800 full members and an additional 27,200 quasi-members who were associated with the organization without being fully initiated. This single organization had more members than most countries' military forces. Other major groups included the Sumiyoshi Kai, based in Tokyo and known for political connections, the Inagawa Kai, which focused on entertainment industry infiltration and gambling operations, and dozens of smaller organizations that controlled specific operations that demonstrated their integration into Japanese society. Real estate manipulation, artificially driving property values up or down for profit. Stock market schemes involving insider trading and corporate extortion. Entertainment industry infiltration, controlling talent agencies and concert venues. Construction bid rigging, ensuring specific companies won lucrative government contracts in exchange for kickbacks. The Yakuza were so embedded in Japanese society that removing them seemed impossible. They had politicians on their payroll. They had police officers providing information. They had legitimate businesses generating millions in legal profits alongside their criminal enterprises. Then Japan's government decided to try dismantling them anyway, launching what would become one of the most successful campaigns against organized crime in modern history. The first wave, the anti-Yakuza Act of 1992, marked the turning point in Japan's war against the Yakuza. The Japanese government passed the Act for Prevention of Unjust Acts by Organized Crime Group members, commonly called the Anti-Yakuza Act. Yakuza means violence groups, the official term Japanese authorities use for Yakuza, because the organizations had adopted the term Yakuza themselves, romanticizing their outlaw status. The law was clever in its design and reflected a sophisticated understanding of how organizations function. It didn't criminalize membership, which would have violated constitutional protections and created enforcement nightmares. Instead, it criminalized specific behaviors and gave police new powers to intervene in ways previously impossible. Designated groups could be officially labeled as organized crime syndicates by the National Police Agency after a formal review process. Members of designated groups faced restrictions on certain activities, including operating specific types of businesses, engaging in particular financial transactions, and entering certain areas or buildings. Police gained authority to issue cease and desist orders against intimidation and extortion, allowing intervention before violence occurred. Violations of these orders carried criminal penalties, including imprisonment. 24 syndicates were immediately designated upon the law taking effect, including all the major groups like Yamaguchi Gumi, Sumiyoshi Kai, and Inagawa Kai. For the first time, being publicly identified as Yakuza carried official consequences beyond social stigma. The impact was immediate but limited in its first decade. Membership began declining, but slowly, from 123,000 members in 1992 to approximately 91,000 by 2000. A significant drop of 32,000 members over 8 years, but hardly the extinction of organized crime. The Yakuza adapted to the new legal environment. They moved some operations underground, conducting meetings in private rather than public locations. They used non-members as fronts for businesses, having family members or associates hold licenses and ownership papers. They diversified into less visible activities that attracted less law enforcement attention, such as internet-based fraud and offshore investments. They were wounded by the new law, but far from defeated. The old bosses remained in control, and the organizations continued functioning with only modest disruption. The government needed something stronger to achieve their goal of significantly reducing Yakuza power and influence. They needed to attack not just Yakuza operations, but the entire ecosystem that supported them, making it impossible for the organizations to interface with normal society. The Game Changer, Yakuza, Exclusion Ordinances, October 2011. Tokyo becomes the last of Japan's 47 prefectures to enact Yakuza exclusion ordinances. For the first time in Japanese history, all 47 prefectures have local laws specifically designed to cut Yakuza off from normal society in ways that go far beyond the National Anti-Yakuza Act. These ordinances were revolutionary in their approach to fighting organized crime. They didn't target the Yakuza directly, which would require proving membership and criminal activity. Instead, they targeted everyone who did business with them, creating a web of liability that made any interaction with Yakuza legally dangerous for ordinary citizens and businesses. The ordinances prohibited companies from making any payments to Yakuza members or organizations, even for legitimate services. They prohibited landlords from renting property to members, regardless of how well they paid rent or maintained properties. They prohibited banks from providing any services to anyone affiliated with designated groups, including basic checking accounts, savings accounts, loans, credit cards, and wire transfers. They prohibited phone companies from providing service. They prohibited utilities from connecting service to addresses associated with members. They prohibited car dealerships from selling vehicles. They prohibited insurance companies from issuing policies. In effect, they prohibited participation in modern society. Violate these ordinances, and citizens themselves faced penalties that could destroy their livelihoods. Fines reaching millions of yen, business license revocations that ended careers, public shaming through disclosure of violations that destroyed reputations. The government published lists of businesses that had violated the ordinances, making them targets of public boycotts. This was third-party policing on a massive scale, unprecedented in democratic countries. The government enlisted every business, landlord, bank, and service provider in Japan as enforcers of anti-Yakuza policy. The message was clear and unambiguous. Doing business with the Yakuza makes you a criminal too, with all the legal and social consequences that entails. The impact was devastating beyond anything the Yakuza had experienced in their long history. Yakuza members found themselves unable to rent apartments, even in the cheapest buildings in undesirable neighborhoods. Hotels refused them rooms, scanning IDs against databases of known members. Banks closed their accounts without notice, forcing them to operate entirely in cash. Credit cards were canceled, making online purchases and reservations impossible. Phone companies terminated service, cutting off their primary means of communication. Car dealerships refused sales even when members had cash. Even public toll roads began barring them, using license plate recognition systems connected to databases of members' vehicles. Their children couldn't enroll in schools when administrators discovered parental affiliations. Their families faced social ostracism, with neighbors refusing to speak to them and communities organizing to force them out. Imagine waking up one day and discovering you can't legally engage in modern society. You can't sign a lease, forcing you to live with family or in vehicles. You can't open a bank account, forcing you to carry all your money as cash. You can't get a phone, preventing employment and emergency services access. You can't rent a car or buy a vehicle. Your children face discrimination at school. Your family members lose jobs when employers discover their connection to you. This wasn't imprisonment in a conventional sense. It was civil death, exclusion from society so complete that survival required either leaving the organization or living as a complete outcast. A case study from Oita Prefecture illustrates the extraordinary power of these ordinances. A mid-sized construction company that had unknowingly executed a single transaction with a Yakuza-linked business found itself unable to secure new contracts when the connection was discovered. Banks refused financing for pending projects. Suppliers cut ties, refusing to deliver materials even for projects already underway. Customers canceled contracts, citing reputational risk. The company's name appeared on a public list of ordinance violators. Within 6 months, the company collapsed not because of criminal prosecution, but because association alone destroyed its reputation and business relationships. The owner, who had been unaware of the Yakuza connection and had cooperated fully with investigators, lost everything he'd built over 20 years. The ordinances created a self-enforcing system that required minimal police resources to maintain. Businesses became terrified of accidental association because the penalties for unknowingly doing business with Yakuza could destroy decades of work. This incentivized exhaustive background checks on all customers, vendors, and partners. Companies began using specialized services that checked individuals against databases of known Yakuza members, their relatives, their associates, and their front companies. This paranoid vetting process further isolated Yakuza members, making even simple transactions like buying groceries or renting equipment legally risky for the sellers. The demographic collapse. By 2024, Yakuza membership had plummeted to 18,800 members across all designated organizations. Full members numbered only 9,900. Quasi-members numbered 8,900. This represented a decline of over 165,000 members since the peak in the 1960s, an almost 90% reduction. But raw numbers don't tell the complete story of the Yakuza's collapse. The remaining members weren't just fewer, they were aging, creating demographic challenges that made organizational survival increasingly difficult. By the end of 2022, the average age of Yakuza members was 54 years old. More than half of all members were over 50 years old. Approximately 10% were over 70 years old. And some bosses were in their 80s, still nominally in control of chapters. Think about what that means for a criminal organization. When your average gang member is 54 years old, you're not a viable criminal organization capable of violence and intimidation. You're a retirement community with criminal records, facing age-related health problems and declining physical capabilities. Young people stop joining in the numbers necessary to sustain the organizations. Why would they? The romance of Yakuza life depicted in films and manga had been replaced by the brutal reality of social exclusion that made normal life impossible. No bank accounts meant no mortgages or car loans. No apartments meant homelessness or dependence on the organization. No normal life meant no dating, no marriage, no families. And for what reward? Declining revenue from operations that face constant police scrutiny, imprisonment for minor offenses, social ostracism that extended to their entire families. The risk-reward calculation that once favored joining no longer made sense to rational young people with other options. The economic incentive disappeared as enforcement increased. In the 1980s and 90s, Yakuza membership offered significant financial opportunity. Members could earn substantial incomes from illegal activities with relatively low risk of serious consequences. By the 2020s, the same activities carried much higher risks while generating lower revenues due to increased competition from other criminal groups and technological changes that disrupted traditional criminal markets. Japanese culture compounds this demographic problem in ways unique to Japan. In a society that values employment, social harmony, and group belonging more intensely than Western individualistic cultures, being permanently excluded from all three is psychologically devastating in ways difficult for non-Japanese to fully understand. The stigma isn't just legal, it's cultural, spiritual, and social, affecting every aspect of life and identity. Several former Yakuza members who successfully left the life described their experiences to media outlets, providing rare glimpses into the difficulties of departure. One former member explained he couldn't open a bank account for 7 years after leaving, despite having steady employment and no criminal convictions. Another described being unable to rent an apartment despite having left the organization and having steady work in construction, forcing him to live in a company dormitory. A third described his children being bullied at school when classmates learned of his past, forcing his family to relocate multiple times. The message to potential recruits was unmistakable. Once you join, you're marked for life. The tattoos can't be fully removed even with expensive laser treatments. The missing finger joints are permanent identifiers. The criminal records follow you forever. And that mark means permanent exclusion from normal Japanese society, making redemption nearly impossible. The Yamaguchi-gumi split. Even as overall membership declined precipitously, internal conflicts accelerated the collapse of Japan's largest remaining criminal organization. August 2015, the Yamaguchi-gumi, Japan's largest Yakuza organization, split in two in an unprecedented internal rebellion. 13 groups representing thousands of members broke away to form the Kobe Yamaguchi-gumi, creating an immediate rival organization that claimed the same territory and criminal markets. The split stemmed from long-simmering disputes over leadership style and finances. The Yamaguchi-gumi's sixth-generation boss, Kenichi Shinoda, faced criticism from factions who felt marginalized by his leadership and excluded from profitable operations. Traditional geographic and cultural divisions within the organization erupted into open conflict when Shinoda allegedly showed favoritism to certain chapters while demanding larger financial contributions from others. The breakaway groups, primarily from the Kansai region, felt they were being exploited to fund operations in other areas without receiving proportionate benefits. The split wasn't peaceful. Police designated it a gang war, deploying additional officers to affected areas. Violence erupted across multiple prefectures as the two organizations fought for control of territory and criminal markets. Drive-by shootings targeted bosses' homes and businesses. Stabbings occurred during confrontations at bars and restaurants. Fire bombings destroyed offices and vehicles. Between 2015 and 2025, the conflict claimed at least a dozen lives and resulted in hundreds of arrests on weapons charges, assault, and attempted murder. April of 2017 brought another fracture. Several groups broke away from the Kobe Yamaguchi Gumi to form Kizuna Kai, meaning bonds association, citing similar complaints about leadership and financial arrangements. The fragmentation continued, with what had been one massive criminal organization now divided into three competing groups, each significantly smaller and weaker than the original organization. By 2025, exhaustion had set in on all sides. April 2025 brought surprising news. The Yamaguchi Gumi and Kobe Yamaguchi Gumi declared an end to their decade-long feud. Executives from both groups met secretly and pledged to avoid causing trouble, a vague commitment that suggested mutual recognition of weakness rather than genuine reconciliation. But this wasn't reconciliation from a position of strength. It was admission of weakness. Both organizations had been so depleted by police pressure, membership decline, aging demographics, and internal conflict that continuing the war was unsustainable. They simply didn't have the resources, manpower, or capability to maintain large-scale conflicts anymore. The truce represented surrender to the reality that the Yakuza's era of dominance had ended. The future of organized crime in Japan. By 2026, the question isn't whether the traditional Yakuza will survive. Most analysts agree they won't, at least not in any form resembling their 20th century peak. The question is what replaces them, and whether that replacement is better or worse for Japanese society. Japan's success in dismantling the Yakuza may have created a more dangerous, unpredictable criminal landscape that challenges law enforcement in new ways that traditional policing methods cannot address.